This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 899 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. I really start my redraft research, my season-long fantasy football research, in early May. The winter months are spent figuring out the NFL draft and doing some dynasty research. But once the draft is over, things flip. My brain goes into redraft mode. I start really working on the draft guide, and the content that you consume on here is geared towards that particular season. That starts in May. By the time the season kicks off, it's early September. A lot can change in those 3 or 4 months. And that's why I feel this episode is necessary to do each and every year. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about the players who have gone up the most in my rankings over the last weeks and months. And then I'm going to talk about the guys who have fallen the most. That way we're on the same page as we approach the fantasy football season. Now, before getting into things, I wanted to send another reminder about signing up on Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is awesome. They've got best ball drafts and tournaments going on all the time for this year's fantasy season. And those drafts are at all entry points. You don't need tons and tons of money to play. You can join tournaments for $3 and $5 entry fees too. I've been becoming a best ball bro this offseason, and while you don't need to go that hardcore, you can still use those episodes in the podcast feed to help you out, to make you a better best ball player. And I've got a special offer for you too. If you sign up on Underdog Fantasy with promo code LATEROUND, not only will you get a nice deposit offer, but Underdog will send you a free late round draft guide. You can make a $10 deposit and get the guide. The guide costs $25. You're literally saving cash by taking advantage of the offer. Just head to underdogfantasy.com, sign up, and use promo code LATEROUND when you do. Once you make a deposit, the guide will be sent your way. Now let's get to this year's big risers and fallers. The Chiefs' wide receiver room has been kind of a roller coaster this offseason. You had all of the Rashee Rice stuff go down earlier in the year. They signed Marquise Brown. They drafted Xavier Worthy. Then Marquise Brown got hurt, and it's looking less and less likely that Rashee Rice is going to be suspended this year. All the while, Xavier Worthy has looked the part so far in camp and in the preseason. Now, I'm not that surprised by that last note. Worthy was someone that my model really liked. He's someone that I'm into. I did have some concern about what his target total might look like in year one, but I've become less and less concerned about that when looking at how they've deployed him in the preseason. Not only that, but Hollywood Brown is banged up already. In the early parts of the season, that could very easily force more looks to these other two young wide receivers. So Brown was looking really good in like June. He was competing with Worthy for targets, and there were some real questions as to how the Chiefs might use Worthy here in year one. But that's at least been squashed to some degree. And then all the while, this Rashee Rice suspension is looking more unlikely for 2024. And then Marquise Brown got hurt. So things have gone really south for Brown. He's seen a pretty big drop in my rankings. The other two wide receivers have risen. Rice is interesting because the market still clearly has people who believe that he could be suspended. That's why I added him as a player to target in the draft guide just a couple of weeks ago. And while I'm with some people who are a little bit afraid of Rice's true ceiling in the league after what we saw last year, and last year was this low A-dot roll where he generated a lot of yards after the catch, he likely saw a bump in target share last year due to lack of competition. I get all of that. I don't think we can just dismiss, though, the idea that Rice just gets better as a second-year player. He scored well in my year two model. He was in the range where we see a lot of elite players. And just look at history. Rice hit 13.3 PPR points per game last year. There have been 19 wideouts since 2011 with next season data who hit 13 or more PPR points per game as a rookie. Of those 19, only 3 of them ended up scoring fewer than 14 PPR points per game. It's actually 14.4 during year 2. That's a wide receiver 2 season. 16 of the 19 wide receivers were wide receiver 2s during their sophomore year in the NFL. Now, like I said, I've had my own concerns about Rashee Rice, the player. He didn't really play a typical wide receiver role last year. It was sort of Jarvis Landry-esque. But that doesn't mean that he can't improve. or that he won't still see a relatively decent target share even with more offensive weapons in Kansas City. So basically, I'm higher than the market on Rice and Worthy now, and I'm more concerned about Hollywood Brown. That's been a shift in my rankings. I've brought up the Seattle backfield quite a bit on the show over the last handful of weeks, whether it be on this show, last week's mailbag episode, or becoming a best ball bro. Now, I was initially very in on Zach Charbonnet, at least in best ball. I wasn't as in on Walker. I was still drafting Walker in best ball, but not at the same rate as I was drafting Zach Charbonnet. That's flipped a little bit over the last month. I still think Charbonnet is fine in best ball because of the injury upside, but my fear in a managed season-long league is that he just ends up being strictly a handcuff without much flex appeal, because the Seahawks coaching staff does seem to really like Kenneth Walker. But let's take a step back. Why was I into Charbonnet at cost versus Walker at his in the first place? Well, first off, he was cheaper, and he still is cheaper. Spending a double-digit round pick on Zach Charbonnet is not going to burn you. But also, a lot of Charbonnet's numbers last year weren't any worse than Kenneth Walker's. In fact, they were arguably better. Sharps had a better yards after contact per attempt rate. He had a better success rate. His yards over expected per attempt was also better. And he gained 10 or more yards at a better clip than Walker too. Now, he faced stacked boxes less frequently than Kenneth Walker did. But Walker wasn't so glaringly better than Zach Charbonnet. Walker's always been more of a home run hitting running back with a ton of explosiveness. There was a chance that this coaching staff just liked Charbonnet's style more, and they would end up giving him more work than expected. And that last part is key to the June and into July Charbonnet thesis for me. But this coaching staff is talking very clearly about Walker being the starter, and they've said multiple times that they think that he's a 3-down back. More importantly, they've talked up using Walker more as a receiver. Now, this is something I talked through on last week's mailbag episode, but I think the masses sometimes do a poor job in understanding what this kind of coach speak can look like, what it means. We have to always lead with talent. We have to lead with our talent-based evidence. Kenneth Walker might not be a bad pass catcher, but he's never been a volume receiver out of the backfield. He wasn't one in college. He's yet to be one in the NFL. To me, though, being a good enough pass catcher isn't overly difficult for an NFL running back. You'll have some guys who are just not that natural in doing it. And then you'll have some players like Christian McCaffrey who are absolutely insane at catching passes. But the majority of players, the majority of running backs are somewhere in the middle. That's where Kenneth Walker likely is. Even if he's below average, he can still see some volume there. So that means that his 8% target share, based on the reports and how they might want to deploy him, that hypothetically could turn into a 10%, 11% target share. The problem is people then taking those reports way too far and ignoring the body of work. And they start making assumptions that the target share will get to 15 or 16%. That Kenneth Walker is going to be a 60 or 70 catch running back. Not only is that just way too high for a player like Walker, but Seattle has a lot of competition in that passing attack. Now, coach speak matters to me more at running back than wide receiver and tight end, because coaches can completely change a running back's volume based on who they have on the field. If they want a split backfield, we have to recognize that and play into it and try to read it. The talent profile matters because it's going to guide those coaches to a rational decision, but it's not that simple. So I originally had Walker in that tier after Joe Mixon, Rachaad White, and Josh Jacobs. I think he belongs in that tier now. I think he belongs with those guys. And that's made me actually slightly higher than the market on Kenneth Walker. At the very least, I'm definitely not lower than the market with Walker. And I know that because I've gotten him in season-long drafts this month. And then meanwhile with Charbonnet, I've sort of let him just be the upside best ball pick as opposed to a season-long pick. I think he's much easier to take in a season-long league with big benches because you can just stash him. But if you're in a 10 or a 12 team league with 5 bench spots, I'd try to get a little bit more secured production. I was in on DeAndre Hopkins this offseason. There are 2 trends with middle round wide receivers, or as I've defined it, wideouts who go in that wide receiver 25 to wide receiver 42 range. There are 2 trends that he fits really well. Trends that we look for in breakout wide receivers. or wide receivers who far outplay their ADP. One of those is that really old wide receivers in that range have historically actually been quite good. My reasoning as to why that's the case is because sort of a survivorship bias. The fact that these guys are still getting drafted as wide receiver 3s and high-end wide receiver 4s, despite being in their 10th, their 11th year in the league, that tells us that they're good players. But also, players in that range with strong previous season peripherals also do well, specifically in yards per route run. And Hopkins was right in line. He was actually better in yards per route run last year than his previous 2 seasons. The issue is that he's now dealing with this knee injury. He's a 32-year-old wide receiver entering the year with a banged up knee. Now, the Titans are optimistic about week 1 with DeAndre Hopkins. That's great. But that's obviously going to push the dude down in my rankings. Again, he's a 32-year-old wide receiver with a bad knee. Now, with all that being said, a lot of other drafters have done the same with DeAndre Hopkins. So I'm actually still drafting him at his new ADP. But there's definitely a lot more risk than there was a month ago here. He's not as much of a glaring value, so he's been a faller for me. We know to target ambiguous backfields in fantasy football. Or at least, if you've consumed my content over the last decade, you know that's the type of backfield that you want to look for in the middle rounds. Not a backfield where there's a standalone RB1. There are a ton of intriguing backfields that I'm targeting this year. Intriguing ambiguous backfields. And it's not just one player from those backfields. I like both Pittsburgh backs, Jalen Warren injury aside. I like the Tennessee backfield and getting exposure to both Pollard and Spears. And then there's Cincinnati. At the start of the offseason, I was higher than the market on both Zach Moss and Chase Brown. But I had Moss straight up ahead of Brown, cost aside. But the more that I've thought about that situation over the last couple of months, and the more that I've read about that situation, I've flipped. I'm more into Brown now, though I still think Moss is fine to grab too. Brown's always been an explosive back. He tested well at the combine, and we saw his big playability in action as a rookie last year. He didn't see a ton of work, but he definitely showed off his explosiveness. The fear with Brown was that maybe, just maybe, the Bengals wouldn't use him as much in a receiving role this year. Because in 2023, he didn't really play that much on third down. He had just 4 rush attempts on third down and 2 of his receptions were on third down. Every sign points to him being the pass catching back for that team this year, though. Maybe something happens where someone like Samaje Perine's cut by the Broncos and then he's signed by the Bengals. And maybe Cincinnati wants to use Perine in that role. But Brown is looking like a player who's at least going to split some early down work and then see most of the receiving work. And it's not even a lock that Zach Moss sees all the goal line work. Chase Brown is a lot bigger than people realize. Pass catching generally trumps any other trend that we might be looking for with middle round running backs, with running backs in general. In most formats, you'd prefer a pass catching running back over a goal line running back. Because it's not like the pass catching running back can't score touchdowns. It's not like he'll never see a single goal line rush. Brown's also a second year running back. That's usually the kind of runner that you want to target in the middle rounds. Now, there's nothing wrong with Zach Moss at his price, but there does seem to be a lot more upside with Chase Brown. And that upside's become more and more evident over the last couple of months. So I'm higher than the market on this entire backfield, but especially with Chase Brown, specifically in a redraft format, of course. Now, I talked at length about this on last week's Becoming a Best Ball Bro, but I know that not everyone listens to that show. I also want to provide more detail about the backfield here, that backfield being the Chargers backfield. Daniel Popper of The Athletic published an article last week which left Kamani Vidal off the Chargers' final roster. And the fantasy football world went absolutely nuts over it. Anyone who listens to this show knows that I like Vidal the talent. It's not even the situation that I bought into, which is a good situation. Vidal's a prospect who had good production at a smaller program. He has burst. He can pass protect. He's a good pass catcher. Layer the team situation on top of that, which is a run-heavy environment with 2 beatable running backs at the top of the depth chart, and he seemed like a slam dunk late-round dart throw. Now, when I say something like that, the reaction is to think that I'm obsessed with the guy, and I think that there's no chance that things can go south. Folks, he's a day 3 pick. Day 3 running backs do not work out at a high rate whatsoever. Of course this might not work out. In fact, the chance that it doesn't work out far, far exceeds the chance that it does. And with a day 3 pick, there's always a chance the player gets cut. Now, with that being said, it was tough to go all in on that article and make the assumption that Vidal was going to get cut. I said as much on Becoming a Best Ball Bro last week. Vidal got off to a slow start because of an injury, and that's what largely was being reported in that article. He then finally got some work this past weekend, and he looked pretty good. That was nice to see. But Vidal still dropped in my rankings simply because he hasn't been on the field. He'll move back up a bit after seeing him over the weekend, though. Now, Vidal has stayed as a late round target for me in redraft leagues. I stopped drafting him over the last week and a half in best ball, but I'm more optimistic now because he actually was able to play. So he's been a faller, but he's bouncing back. Now, on the flip side, a big riser for me has been J.K. Dobbins, and he's honestly the player who matters more for this episode, in my opinion. Dobbins has not been able to stay healthy throughout his NFL career. He's coming off an injury that usually derails a running back's career. But the fact that we've just seen him play, that he's healthier than I at least expected, you have to move him up. He looks like he's going to open the year as their starter. Now, how long that lasts is totally up in the air. And we should be absolutely cautious with Dobbins' health. But he's cleared a hurdle that I didn't even know that he'd clear. And I'm not sure the market has totally caught up. Throwing darts at this backfield is not a bad idea, whether it's Vidal or Dobbins. Now, I've gone more in their direction because Gus Edwards' lack of receiving upside alongside his cost, but I felt like they were a good pair to shout out on today's show. I like Jermaine Burton as a prospect. He's someone I targeted pretty heavily in best ball drafts in June and early July. And that was kind of a mistake because there's been a lot of Andrei Iosivas hype over this offseason, especially over the last month. He may be the 1-to-1 Tyler Boyd replacement in that Bengals offense. Now, Burton can play all over the field, but there's a real chance that he's more of a field stretcher early on, here in year 1. And that puts the Bengals in an interesting spot, given Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are both perimeter guys. I thought they'd maybe shift Chase to the slot in 3 wide sets, but Iosivas is almost definitely going to be the starter to open up the year. So Iosivas has gotten a bump. Burton has been pushed down my rankings. With that being said, I have a hard time thinking a guy from Princeton who is just a fine prospect, who didn't do that much as a rookie, I have a hard time assuming that he's going to be the one that keeps Jermaine Burton, a guy from Alabama who had a really good prospect profile, that he's going to keep him off the field, at least for the entirety of the season. Just from a talent evaluation standpoint and what my model says, I do still prefer Jermaine Burton. But if the team wants to go in a direction, they'll go in that direction. It's hard to remember a coach going out to the media and talking down on a running back the way that Dennis Allen has done so with Kendre Miller. 3 weeks ago, Allen voiced his annoyance with Miller's health. And then just a handful of days ago, according to Roto-World, Allen said that nothing's changed with Miller's health and the way that he feels. That was Roto-World talking about an ESPN report and soundbite. Now, I don't know if Miller's going to be straight up cut, but there are huge concerns there. So he's obviously bumped down my rankings over the last month, though he wasn't super high to begin with. And the market's adjusted too. Kendre Miller has fallen a lot in drafts. But one thing that's kind of weird is that Alvin Kamara's rank over on Fantasy Pros, or even his ADP in a lot of places, it's maybe risen a tad, but not by a whole lot. Kamara, to me, is a riser. I get why people are hesitant to draft him. He's 29 years old. It's his 8th year. Only 10 running backs since 2011 have hit 15 or more PPR points per game in year 8 or later. Odds are not in Alvin Kamara's favor. But I can't stress this enough. Pass-catching running backs are so important in fantasy football. Kamara is still going to at least play that role, despite his lack of efficiency over the last couple of years. And for the record, that lack of efficiency needs some context. He was better than Jamal Williams last year in yards after contact per attempt, and he was way better in success rate. And then in 2022, it was the exact same deal against his backfield competition. The Saints offense just has not been giving him any help. But he's still seeing receiving work, and that receiving work is making him a very good fantasy asset. And why should we think that's going to go away this year? Jamal Williams and probably Kendre Miller, that's his toughest competition. Williams isn't used heavily as a receiver. Miller didn't have a fantastic receiving profile in college. Like, this is still Alvin Kamara's backfield at the very least from a pass catching perspective. And it's an offense that should look better year over year simply because of their offensive coordinator change. But Kamara finishes the RB3 in PPR points per game last year. And running backs drafted as RB2s, so RB13 to RB24 since 2014, who have strong pass catching profiles, they've done very, very well. 75% of them who had a 10% target share ended up scoring 14 or more PPR points per game. 41% of them hit 16 or more PPR points per game. A 10% target share for a healthy Alvin Kamara is basically a lock. So I've been targeting Kamara more than avoiding. And the stuff with Kendre Miller only reinforces that idea. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure you're also subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football YouTube channel. I'm doing live streams over there all the time. We also have videos of becoming a best ball bro and late round perspectives there too. Check it out and subscribe. It's youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with another episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro.